normal people become terrified of criminals.
Shots were just fired. Police just came out and told us, and we're headed there right now.
They become terrified of their own government.
Tweet from Ben Shapiro, who says, Candace, if you feel that taking money from the Daily Wire somehow comes between you and God, by all means quit. And that is a bold response to Candace Owens' tweet, which is, my understanding, is a Bible verse, but Seamus might be better versed with this. Candace Owens tweeted, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye, when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." In response to this, Ben said, "By all means quit," to which Candace replied, You have been acting unprofessional and emotionally unhinged for weeks now, and we have all had to sit back and allow it, and have all tried to exercise exceeding understanding for your raw emotion, but you cross a certain line when you come for scripture and read yourself into it. I will not tolerate it. So needless to say, things are getting rather interesting. And if you're wondering why they're fighting, what this is all about, it has to do with Israel-Palestine. Recently, Ben Shapiro was seen on video saying that Candace Owens' faux sophistication was disgraceful as it pertained to what was going on. And Candace Owens has a video where she said that her point was simply, why are we so concerned about what's going on in Israel when our own universities are teaching children, young people, to demonize white people? Why are we spending so much money and energy on foreign countries when we should be securing our borders and helping the American people? And I'm like, yeah, I agree with Candace on that. For that, Candace tweets this, "Blessed are the peacemakers," which is to imply perhaps ceasefire. And that's what a lot of people are reading into it. Ben, of course, has just told her to quit. And now we've got, I think I actually have this tweet from Mike Cernovich. Let's see if I can pull this up. Mike Cernovich, well, we've got a couple, actually. Here's Tucker Carlson, and where's the Mike Cernovich one? Okay, I guess I might not have it. But Mike Cernovich said it was constructive termination, which is basically when you create a pressure in your company that is, so they're going to have to quit. A single instance can do this. Jack Posobiec says, Candace Owens compares Ben to a BLM activist who accuses someone of being racist if they don't support defunding the police. And Mike Cernovich said, he's become indistinguishable from a far left-wing identity politics woke psycho. He's working the soft cancel culture angle now. I didn't fire Candace, she quit. But he should also look up what constructive termination is. So let's just get into it. I don't know. This is the big story. How you guys doing?
Anybody?
I mean, why don't we have any fun drama? I don't understand.
Anybody that go, like, as far as, like, Cernovich's Cernovich, whatever. His criticism. Anyone that touches on identity politics starts to sound like the people, whether they intend to or not, they're going to sound like they're diving into identity politics, whether it be, white people talking about their whiteness or whatever, or if you're complaining about white people and whiteness or whatever. Anytime you touch that, you can't help but sound like the people that are
like leftists.
Yeah, like you're leftists, like you're a victim, like you need some kind of special accommodation because people are offending you for talking about that. And it doesn't matter who does it. It doesn't matter whether it's a Jewish person, a white person, a black person. It doesn't matter. That's just the way you come off when you go into that area.
I got to issue what I wouldn't describe as a hard journalistic correction, but a failed, what's the right word? A failed insight on my part. I said the other day that Candace and Ben arguing over this stuff and having a kind of a public spat is just good for the Daily Wire. It's press attention, which is true. And that it probably wouldn't go beyond this. They're going to criticize each other. But now Ben's telling her to quit, which I don't know if you guys have legal expertise to some degree, but it seems to me that if you have a contract with someone and then you publicly say you should quit, you've just given them legal recourse to terminate their contract.
I think what's going on here is that Daily Wire is a fiefdom, and they like to have kind of a stable of people in their team, but who are completely under their thumb. Remember the Crowder business, which happened not that long ago. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was so odd because what would appear to be a private negotiation suddenly erupts into public. Well, why? Well, apparently what Crowder was kind of balking against was the idea of, quote, being owned by the Daily Wire. right? And I think this is what's going on here, is that Candace is a very independent spirit. She's actually got a pretty good ego. She wants to be her own person. And yet somehow she's corralled into the Daily Wire's stable, and they expect her to, quote, behave. And she doesn't really think she needs to. She's Candace.
She doesn't need to.
She doesn't need to.
Yeah.
And so I see this as a kind of, I mean, you could have had the philosophical debate without this acrimony. So it's very interesting that the two have become conflated.
But do you think Ben Shapiro could have had the philosophical debate without the emotion behind it? Because it's so much tied to his core identity and how he views the world. Maybe Candace could have, because she's a little bit more removed, but someone who's tied to the religious and ethnic groups that are involved, it's much harder.
Well, I think that is right. I mean, I do think that this is the make or break issue for Ben. I think it is the lens through which other issues are filtered. And also, even if you take a position that said something like, this is anti-Israel, but it's not necessarily anti-Semitism. Boom, you've like violated the taboo. You're like suddenly on the outs. So I think this is a case where in Daily Wire, a relative lockstep is being demanded. And Candace just won't play along with that. And so you've got this public spat.
And I assume this happens at all major media companies, right? I'm sure Fox has had the same issues as it's grown. There are some people who feel as though they can't question their boss on certain issues.
Well, I mean, the thing about it is, you want to be clear in advance about what you stand for. So if Daily Wire were basically say, listen, we want a variety of views, but kind of no variety on this one topic. This is kind of a bright line for us. Then you wouldn't join Daily Wire if you intended to step out of line. But it looks to me like what happened with Daily Wire was that they were like, let's get some really big personalities into our tent. And even the phrase that was used in the context of Crowder, wage slavery, which is kind of an old phrase out of Marx in the 19th century, that's what really rankled Crowder, because he's like, I'm not going to be your slave. You might pay me well, but nevertheless, I'm still my own man. And I think I hear the same echo here.
I gotta tell you, man. When the Crowder thing went down, I brought up how we had negotiations with the guys at the Daily Wire, and I think they're fantastic. The negotiations and the conversations that I had with co-CEO Jeremy Boring were probably the most refreshing business negotiations I've ever had in any circumstance, where I felt like he wasn't lying to me. And I respect that tremendously. I'm not kidding, man. When I've met with these big podcast companies back like several years ago, when I've met with big corporate news, they're blowing smoke up you get what I'm saying. I sit down with Jeremy, and it was like a real conversation about what's going on, what we could do, why we could do it. And you know what it ultimately came down to is I don't know that I could do a deal like this because I'm kind of a crazy guy, and I might want to buy a billboard that says, Liz Cheney is a fat pig or something like that. And they chuckled and they were like, fair point, And so I don't know if I mentioned that before. I think I did, because I was like, I would like to insult people like warmongers who I greatly despise. I do get a lot of people saying, no, they'll never come on your show, Tim. Don't you get it? And I'm like, well, I guess.
As if like Liz Cheney was going to come do Timcast and subject herself to a 2-hour interview where she was asked tough questions about the things she's been involved with. Like that was ever going to happen.
So, but ultimately it comes down to this. Like, I saw this outright when I sit down with them, and they're like, what are the potentials that we have? Because they're like, we love what you do. And then I was like, and I'm a fan of what the Daily Wire does, especially in the culture war. And then ultimately it came down to one simple question of, obviously, like, money plays a role, but Daily Wire is flush with cash. But the real issue is, look, man, I'm going to take my money and I'm going to do weird things with it. I'm going to do. I want to culture jam. I want to shock the system. I want to say things that are offensive. And they were like, fair point. Then we'll work on things, but we'll keep it professional. I said, cool.
I mean, whenever you're at an institution of any kind, you're subject to the institution, its investors, its donors. I mean, I've been at the American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institution. It always occurred to me that I have a measure of independence, because when you're in a think tank, basically they pay you to do whatever you want. Dinesh, write books, give speeches. And so I was like, this is the best gig ever. But I realized, well, how does AEI fund it? Well, they're funded by corporations. They're funded by a handful of big donors. You can't run athwart those guys, because then there's someone to complain to. And if you become a liability, they're going to offload you.
I do want to mention, because I see like super chats where they're saying, I'm with Candace on this one. I'm like, that's the beauty of the Daily Wire, though. They've got you choosing sides, the Daily Wire. Unless, of course, Candace does quit. And that would be I think that would be like a nuclear bomb going off for the Daily Wire if Candace actually leaves. I'm hoping that this is just like kind of a half-thought stunt of some sort. Like Candace really isn't that
like
angry
Will
about-
Smith. You mean you think it's it's a variation of the Hollywood
Right.
production?
Yep, like who did Will Smith slap? Was it
Chris Rock.
Chris Rock.
But then it turns out he wasn't even with his wife. Jada,
That's right.
Just came out and was like, we've been separated for 100 years.
Yeah.
That's so gross. That just makes the whole thing worse.
So much
I mean, I think this fight or this dispute online is going to be something progressive media outlets try and progressive media outlets try and capitalize on as, look, these right-wing enterprises are fracturing, they're falling apart, to direct from the fact that they also have a lot of issues.
The Israeli Palestine conflict is splitting both the left and the right and really making people pick sides. I imagine that Candace doesn't have a strong... I imagine it would make sense to think that Candace doesn't have as strong of an opinion as Ben, obviously, because Ben's got family in Israel, so...
But she's an American. She could have a strong opinion that America shouldn't spend money on foreign wars.
But I think Ben looks at the whole thing as beyond that.
Yeah.
We're living in a time, and this is not the way things used to be, but where institutions tend to be defined by one guy. Even if you go back to the old National Review, it was Bill Buckley. You have a lot of other guys around him, but like it's Buckley's magazine. Commentary was Norman Pudhord's magazine. And, this is the Tim Pool operation.
It's a Seamus.
It's really more the Seamus operation. But I mean, not a lot of people know that.
Talk about it.
I got D'Souza Media. And so I think what happens at Daily Wire is it is Ben Shapiro, but then you've got these other guys who are kind of luminaries in their own right. And so now the issue is a little unclear. Who's the brand?
But it's really simple, actually. If you look at all of their personalities, they're homegrown. But Candace Owens was recruited. Candace Owens was already big, was already popular, was already moving politically, like influencing.
And Jordan Peterson, actually.
Well, right. Yeah. So, but Knowles and Clavin, these are their homegrown personalities that they've built up. Matt Walsh, and they've done a tremendous job in getting attention and building influence for their hosts. But Michael Knowles worked for the company and then has now become one of the biggest social and political commentators.
Well, I kind of want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, Dinesh. You said that the Daily Wire grabs different people so that they can have a large tent, reach a broad audience, and have a lot of different influencers. I think that's true. And I think, interestingly enough, that's actually symbolic of a broader issue with the conservative movement, which is we've tried to welcome everybody into the tent, and we actually don't have principles or know how to define ourselves anymore as a result of that. So when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, obviously that's something where I think there can be diversity of opinion, but there are so many social issues like abortion, homosexuality, LGBTQ issues more broadly speaking, where the right doesn't even know what it believes because we've expanded the tent out to everybody who the left has said they don't like. And so we've actually allowed our enemies to decide what our movement is.
I don't disagree with that, but I think generally American culture is very ambiguous. We don't have a defined cultural identity that people theoretically could assimilate to. So it becomes difficult to say where any lines are, and then you add policy on top of that.
You don't think America had like a broad overarching culture?
I think we could, and we did at one point, but I think as it stands right now, Americans are very resistant to cultivating American culture. I mean, think about everyone who was like, if Trump gets elected, I will move to Canada. Like, there's all kinds of resistance to being American. If that's how our young people feel, then we have failed as a culture to maintain a cultural identity.
Young people in the United States, a lot of the people that I end up working with when I'm like touring and stuff like that, younger people really they want to avoid the nationalist idea, and that comes...
Or just patriotism.
Well, that's what they see patriotism as nationalism. They see American flags and they're turned off by it. And some people that I'm really, really close to and that I have a really great relationship with, they don't see a love of country as something that's important. They think of themselves as global. And I do understand that that's a little bit more of that is probably because of the people that I'm around. They travel around the world. They're playing concerts and performing in places all over the world. So that does make people feel less connected to an individual place. But it is something that is true among younger people in the United States. And I think that it's partially because we have, between Gen X and possibly the millennials, they didn't instill a pride in young people, and they didn't really, civics was taken out of school and stuff, and people don't understand why America is special and what about our government system is special and why it should be preserved.
And you add to that the younger generations, I mean, the millennial generation, my generation, and Gen Z and Gen Alpha are growing up in a world where everything is being handed to you. And I don't mean everything, but your bare necessities. Now, I get it. Expanding beyond that is becoming increasingly difficult. Owning a home is becoming increasingly difficult. But when your whole life is playing with your friends, going to school, coming home and eating Rice Krispie squares or whatever and Tang from your mom, and it's not having to chop wood, otherwise you freeze to death in the winter, we are building multiple generations of people who don't know what it takes to survive. And that breeds entitlement and resentment, and without any sense of community, that's Antifa, it's chaos, it's the far left, it's the woke cult.
Well, I think we've also manufactured quite a lot of cynicism, some intentionally and some otherwise. So just to speak to my own experience, people in my generation can probably relate to this. I was 6 when 9/11 happened, and immediately there were just American flags everywhere. Everyone was talking about patriotism and coming together as a country. And then what that was used for was basically to push for these wars that basically everybody now looks back on and says, we're bad for the country. So for a lot of people in my demographic, their first introduction to patriotism and to love of country was abused in such a way to give handouts to the industrial military complex and do things that ultimately were not good for the country. So people are less willing to come on board with common projects that actually are good for the nation.
I want to.
That's not new. I mean, young people being disillusioned with America and the flag and not being patriotic. It's not really that new. I mean, we're Gen Xers, and we were raised in the 80s, and we had Ronald Reagan, and I think we were raised in a certain era of greater patriotism. But there still was a big contingent who thought that Ronald Reagan was more evil than the Soviet Union. I mean, they really did. So this is, I mean,
I'm not
it has to be put in context.
Hold on, I just want to make
downhill, you know?
Well, it's not.
Well, because, and I mean, I think academia is, and I mean, Dinesh D'Souza wrote the book on it, A Liberal Education. It was one of the first books that opened my eyes about what they're indoctrinating kids with. And now when you have your own children in college, you really see it. But I do think things need to be put in context a little, because what they said about Trump, they said about Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
You know, there was a brief window where George
happened-
W. Bush was a hero, and then all of a sudden, he's the next Hitler.
We had the Vietnam War, and
right.
there was a massive young people's revolt against that. And then Reagan came along, and Reagan found a middle ground that has suddenly somehow been lost. The middle ground was called the Reagan Doctrine. So the Reagan Doctrine is that people must fight for their own freedom. We don't fight for them. It's their country, they fight. We help. So the classic model of this was the Soviets invade Afghanistan. They occupied with 100,000 troops. There are all these Afghan mujahideen who want to fight back. Reagan's like, I'm not sending a single soldier, but I'll send some CIA advisors. I'll give you some Stinger rockets to shoot down some Soviet helicopters. And the beauty of this was that it allowed that kind of libertarian desire to have freedom spread worldwide, but without a kind of costly deployment and extended deployment of troops. And then once the Iraq War came along, we went to preemptive war. We went to, what did those guys have to do with 9/11? We went to the idiotic, where did that come out of a store? Like if you break it, you own it. What? If you get rid of a dictator of a country, you now have the job of rebuilding the country. What? So all this kind of madness. This is almost like neoconservatism gone berserk. But Reagan was never on board with any of this.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. Hang out with us live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. and become a member over at timcast.com for uncensored, members-only shows exclusive. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.